Welcome to another episode of The Frustrated CEO. This podcast series is designed to address what keeps you, the CEO, up at night and frustrated. And we offer proven guidance for greater influence, action, and success by helping you with some very clear guidelines, steps you can take tomorrow or this afternoon to help you lessen your frustration. Today, I'm here with my colleagues, Leb Tannenbaum and Patrick Lyons, and we're going to dive into a subject that's very near to my heart, but we're also seeing showing up over and over again with many of the CEOs we work with, and that is leadership presence. How do we show up with confidence, credibly, and able to influence those we're acting with? I am thrilled to have as our guest today, Katherine Johnson. Katherine is the founder and president of True Self Executive Presence. She has worked nationally with many CEOs, politicians, go figure, and elite athletes. She is also the co-host of the Women's Center for Leadership Career Boost, where she hosts a weekly conversation with leaders in the community that help us develop new skills that we can apply directly to our work lives. Welcome, Katherine.
Hi, Patsy. Thanks for having me.
Sure, it's a pleasure. So tell us, how do you see executive presence, or how do you help leaders become more effective by building trust, credibility, and influence?
Simply put, presence is about how we show up. It's literally how we approach the people that we hope to connect and influence. And so it's a constellation of cues that we carry with us, and we're constantly signaling to others. So we have to understand outside of our words all the ways in which we're communicating and how that's either helping us connect with others, helping us build trust and credibility, or how it's undermining it. Because there's lots of different cues we're sending. And if there's any kind of dissonance, we're actually making it harder for people to connect with us in our messages.
So that's interesting, because we know from our work that leaders have the greatest influence on their organization's culture. And yet we hear over and over frustrations from CEOs that my people don't listen to me, or they can't get their message across. So is that a lot of what you're talking about?
I think it applies, absolutely, because it's frustrating when we don't feel like we're seen or heard. And for leaders, I hear this all the time they don't understand why their message isn't landing with the kind of impact they want, or they feel really misunderstood. So it's imperative that we start looking at their presence, because what we know about how our brains work is that we're constantly in two conversations with people, through verbal conversation, but also there's a nonverbal conversation going on. And when those two aren't congruent, we always go with the nonverbal. So that means if there's any kind of dissonance, we're actually hardwired to believe all the signals we're picking up nonverbally. And a lot of times leaders don't understand that. So they think something is happening. They think they're sending a certain signal, but actually they're broadcasting several different and incongruent messages.
So it's easy to see how frustrating it can be to want to get your message across and it falls flat on your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think of how much intention people put into their words, and they're crafting their strategy, and then it falls flat. It's incredibly frustrating to people.
So I know you've said frequently that leadership is about self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, if you're going to start paying attention to your presence, if you want to know that you're being intentional about the way you show up and how you connect with others, you first have to become self-aware around, who am I? What's important to me? And what are the different signals I'm broadcasting? Because a lot of times how we think we're showing up and how we're perceived can be different. And that misalignment causes a lot of miscommunication. So the self-awareness starts by going a bit deeper than just, oh, I thought about it once and I nailed it and I'm moving on. Because every time you grow and change and evolve, you need your presence to stay with you, right? You need to be like your shadow. As you move, it moves with you instead of it being stuck or perhaps even an outdated or a presence that was more performative in the past, right? How can it be more authentic to who you are?
Yeah, that's really intriguing. I'm wondering, so CEOs, to some degree, are responsible, as an example, for identifying trends, right? So you may get really good in your groove for a while, and then something like the pandemic happens, and you have this ability to help them understand. They may be saying one thing and communicating another. And just to, an illustration for me is, I know an executive whose first pandemic communication, his first COVID communication to his people was laced with fear, right? And wanted to say the right thing and kind of had the right words, but it's not really what came across. And it was this fear of, how are we going to get this done if everybody's remote?
Right.
So he wasn't alone in that, but we had to really step in, not with the skill that you have, but really step in and say, no, that you need to reframe that entire communication and get a hold of the care, like the caring that you have for these people.
Right. What I'm hearing you say too is that awareness to understand, you pointed out to him the impact that was having, which was likely different than what he thought he was, communicating or what he knew was required. But that, the doorway that he took to try to get that message out there wasn't going to land. And that's where the self-awareness comes in, because our inner game, if we can just think about understanding our own personal operating system, it reveals the autopilot that each of us has. And when we can look at what we do when we're on autopilot, it tells us where our attention goes. So let's say it's fear, or let's say in autopilot, we tend to become more directive if we're under stress. It's like when we get squeezed or put under pressure, we each have an autopilot of where we, the kind of mode we go into. And that again can do a disservice if we're not aware of it and making sure, is this the contribution? Is this the way I need to show up in this moment? Because it just becomes this default programming, and we need to understand ourselves so that we can, we can pause and realize we have a lot more capacity within us to respond in a given moment than to just double down on the way we've always, operated.
Katherine, I have a question. You talk about the importance of self-awareness, right? Being aware of when my either verbal or nonverbal communication isn't landing the way I'm intending it. What are some of the obvious signs from your experience? What are some of the obvious signs, or maybe the less obvious signs? If I don't have people around me like Aleb who can say, "Ooh, hold on a second, that's fear-laced. You might want to rephrase that a certain way." How might a listener? What are some of the signs that they could look for that would or a light bulb can go off that what I'm trying to convey isn't landing appropriately?
The first one I'd say is just checking in with yourself of how often do you feel misunderstood, or like you're lacking a strong connection when you're interacting with people. Like, what is that feeling like? What kind of response are you getting? Does it feel like you're engaged in reciprocal relationships, and authentic relationships and connections are being built? Or do things feel really hard, right? Does it feel like a lot of like heavy energy when you connect with people and things aren't happening as organically as you want? Because there's two questions that we're asking about another person when we're meeting, right? It's one, can I trust this person? And two, can I respect this person's capabilities? And in the way academia talks about it is the research, they call it warmth and competence. So we're looking to establish, one, can I trust this person? And that's more important than anything. And two is, can I respect this person's capability, which is competence. People in leadership, it's interesting. The research shows that people, when surveyed about this, appreciate in leaders warmth when they're on the receiving end. And yet, when asked what they value in themselves, what they think is going to be most important, they go with the credibility, which means people tend to start thinking they need to look strong, they need to prove themselves. That's where like our default mode comes in, right? I've just got to like take the lead, and it starts becoming a form of leadership that may not be the most effective form of communication, the most influential. And strength without trust makes strength seen as a threat, because we're still trying to assess, are you an ally or an enemy? Is your strength going to be used to collaborate, or are you a competitor?
Wow.
So one of those, assessments is just gauging how well you're connecting with people, because connection comes from trust, right? And then in terms of nonverbal kind of signals to cue into, one is just how you carry yourself in your body, right? Again, in high stakes situations, I'm going to equate this to being as an athlete. I have a lot of experience there and working with people. When you're in high stakes situations, you don't go even further into your head. It's like the quickest way to choke in a sport is to be in your head. So you have to get back down into your body. And that's also where a sense of personal power comes from. So for people in high stakes environments, you have to look at what your body does. And are you communicating confidence and warmth? Which again, confidence has like a strong frame, but warmth means you're open. You're communicating using, your posture, your hands, your eye contact. Or are you looking confident but closed off, right? You can start paying attention to what your body does, because again, that's a form of nonverbal communication that no matter, you could be saying your values, all these things that sound really great, but if your body language is saying you're closed off and unapproachable, or have no warmth and don't feel like connecting with anybody, people aren't buying what you're selling.
That's great.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I have a question about maybe some of this might be about methodology. So
Okay.
now that we've been remote and using Zoom a whole lot, leaders, and I noticed this for myself, they get to look at themselves more when they're leading a meeting and speaking, or multiple people on a Zoom with them. Prior to the pandemic and now in this remote world, do you do video work with them so they can actually see themselves?
Yes, I did. But it's become so much more at the forefront of needing to pay attention to our presence. And honestly, it's like our presence is now, it's now expanded to every aspect of our little rectangles that we show up in. Right? Because again, we're still looking for, can I trust this person? Can I respect their capabilities? And pretty much we've been limited to two of our senses, right? The visual and the audio. So people whose voices aren't projecting well, people whose lighting is making it that they're literally in the dark in the midst of a meeting, or people, I'm worried they're being forgotten about, or that people aren't taking their message seriously because they're not showing up as competent in their virtual world. So there's still a lot of, it's called thin slicing, right? These are judgments and snap judgments we're making. But what they're doing is they're creating judgments that then, through confirmation bias, we look for confirmation that those snap judgments are accurate. And it's just like you're giving people a lens, and then everything else kind of doesn't get counted as input after that.
Wow, that's really good. So I can see, looking at the box that you're in, that you've been very thoughtful and created this beautiful environment around you, and show up in a particular way. Is that part of the leadership presence coaching in terms of where executives sit when they hold these meetings?
It is. It is. And I'll tell you
that.
why. It's because a lot of my clients are people facing in their work, right? So again, building influence, connection, whether it's one-to-many or one-to-one meetings, they are building rapport and trust and connection with people. And you want to think about, what is it? Where are you meeting them? If you were meeting them in a physical space, would you be inviting them to some like dirty, dark corner where they're not going to feel safe? Or are you wanting to elevate the experience so that they actually feel more connected to you and it's easier? So some of that is just thinking about visual static. If our eyes don't have a place to rest, it's the difference between walking into a beautifully curated, spa resort and walking into a casino that's like ba-ping, 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 and your like nervous system can't settle down. So if you're welcoming someone into your space or a meeting, you want their shoulders to relax and for them to feel like they can just settle into being with you in the same way that you'd be really intentional when you set up a meeting with someone to meet, in real life.
That's good.
But as you're pointing out, it's so hard for us to see ourselves. And now in this virtual environment, we do get that opportunity in these little flat screens. But even so, I would say, what would you say about the people that are really informed and really, care about how their presence is versus, I've seen people for a year still silhouette themselves.
With the lighting.
Yes. So what kind of leader comes to you to say, this is really important to me?
The words that I hear most frequently are, I'm playing a bigger game, or I want to show up. I've been doing all this inner work. Let's say they've been building up their leadership capacity and doing, growing themselves. And then they get this hunch, or they're like, I just don't feel like I'm showing up where people can see me. So they feel invisible. They feel looked over. They don't feel heard. And they're now open, because that's really what it takes, is a growth mindset of being open to saying, what is it that I don't know that I haven't considered? Or maybe I've felt really resistant to this my whole life. Like, I don't like the idea that I have to care because I want my substance to matter. I should be a meritocracy. Like, this feels superficial. I get it. It does feel superficial when we start saying, because there's so many, we know there's a lot of bias. We know there's judgment that's not fair. We know first impressions aren't often right. So there's a lot of, there's a lot right under the surface that does feel uncomfortable. And I think what's unfortunate is then it's like, well, we just throw out the baby with the bathwater type thing. So then we end up thinking, well, I don't want to have to think about this, so I'm just going to ignore it. But the thing is, people are making evaluations of you whether you like it or not. Like, there's no neutral. And having influence and impact means you're in control of your message. You're actually being intentional about how you show up because you care, because your message matters. And that way it isn't, oh, well, then I have to, like, this is a necessary evil. It's actually not that. It's more about, how can I show up as the fullest expression of myself? How can I, if I'm going to take myself seriously and the impact I want to have, how can I think seriously about the message that I'm sending? That I am someone who is trustworthy and credible. And that comes from alignment. That's about synchronicity. It's not about performing as a leader, or, I hate the word image management, because it actually isn't that. It's about showing up as the best version of yourself. And we need help, because we're too close to ourselves to be able to see ourselves honestly.
Yeah, that thought was just occurring to me. We do need help. And when I hear you talk, it's a pretty humbling place.
Absolutely. I get help for this. It's not like I'm outside of being included when we talk about this. And it's incredibly humbling, and it's incredibly vulnerable, because we're talking about how we show up in the world, like taking off our armor, taking off our masks. And if we really want to connect, and we know authentic relationships build influence and build that that ecosystem with others, well, it's not an easy thing to do. In fact, I think it's kind of one of the final hurdles for people, because it's one thing to look completely polished, but it's armor. It's another to be like, you know, the car and what's under the hood is all aligned and in sync, and you know you've got the goods. So it's really about the alignment of your substance and your character and your style. That they create a 3D version of you instead of a like one-dimensional or two-dimensional version of a leader.
What's coming to mind for me when you're talking about that is, I feel like I've heard this from CEOs. I think we all experience it ourselves in different ways, is imposter syndrome. Right? So you're asking me, or you're asking someone to acknowledge, hey, you don't have it all figured out. Like you don't, which I think is our biggest fear as a CEO. I'm supposed to have it all together. I'm supposed to have all the answers. I'm supposed to be whether you're supposed to be the smartest person in the room, you're supposed to be the strongest leader. And every one of us struggles with looking in the mirror and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing, and everyone can see it. And so it just came to mind for me as you were talking about that, the willingness to be vulnerable, and just again, I feel like if we could all just accept every one of us struggles with imposter syndrome, then it kind of what's the word? It not demystifies it. It takes the power away from it, because I have it too. You have it too, and the willingness to be vulnerable and ask for help. How am I showing up? Where do you think I can? The verbal, the nonverbal, the visual. How can I get better and grow?
I think it takes its teeth out of it, you know, out of the imposter syndrome, because it really is nasty, and we all have it, and it is internally generated, right? It's internally generated, and that's why even understanding our operating system can be, if we operate out of fear of what we don't want to be, instead of moving towards the positive version of, you know, our highest contribution in ourself, we're running in fear away from something that we don't want to be, and that doesn't tend to get us to that fully expressed version, right? And so when I'm talking with people around presence, what I want to invite everyone to think about is, we always start with, you know, what do you want to move towards? What do you want to embody? What are the qualities you want to convey and that you want people to experience when you're having a really great connection with them? And they start making this list, and I call it their style recipe. And this is more than just the physical way you're going to present yourself. It's understanding, you know, the intention you want with your overall presence. And then instead of feeling punitive when we do that vulnerable part of looking for where there's, you know, I call it static, or where there's dissonance, we can identify it and remind, like, okay, so what do we need to shift to move towards how you do want to show up? So it doesn't feel so punitive, and that, you know, bringing up the like, oh, I'm doing all these things wrong. It's like, we're typically doing the best we can with what we know, and we're not taught a lot of this. And so doing it with someone who's supportive, or, you know, a coach, or just letting someone in, because it's hardest for us to see ourselves. We want to make it a positive, you know, a growth-oriented experience, not something where we feel greater shame of, oh my gosh, look at how I've been, you know, hiding here with my armor, or look at this. We have to name it, and then keep moving towards what we do want.
Right.
That's good. Yeah, I was working with somebody this morning, and she said, this is such hard work. And she said, I've never felt freer and more myself. And I want more, and I need to really embrace my values. And so there is a moment where it flips, so that we are getting more of that positive contribution.
Yeah,
right.
That's really good. You know, it also comes to mind for me. So, Katherine, you reached a pretty high level in athletics, right? And you know, CEOs have to navigate, executives have to navigate different audiences, and maybe the perception that there are different things at stake. So I'm curious in terms of offering, the best of who you are, and
Mhm.
how much the audience, or if you're playing for a championship versus you're trying to make the playoffs, or and those types of sports analogies. But what about when you're walking into a board meeting and there's a board of directors, and maybe it's a publicly held company and you're the CEO?
Mhm.
Do you armor up in a different way, and then you come back to your executive team and you want to show them how credible you are,
Mhm.
or maybe how warm you are, and then you get to that you're with all the people, or you're with all the people in the middle of the organization, and do you adjust, or are you working with that inner game to say, pay attention to what type of meeting it is,
Mhm.
or you're authentic on your game, all the same all the time? I'm curious.
I like this question. The way I look at it is each person should see themselves. I think we're all of the age where we remember radio dials. Each person is a radio dial, and you move your dial depending, it's context specific, so that you have a range that is all you and it's all authentic. When we feel like this is the box, this is me authentically, and then there's this pressure of like, well, I got to just show up this only way. I think that is quite limiting. And the freedom comes from giving yourself, to be grounded in who you are, and to know that you have that dial and you can turn it. If it's okay, I'm going into a boardroom setting, I'm going to be presenting, again, it's okay, what's most important here? There's a difference between being strong and competent and being completely armored up, right? One of the ways that executive presence is perceived through communication is the ability to use humor to connect, right? It's the as much how we connect, how we read a room, how we use language and tone and body language, as much as the words, because there's plenty of people who are incredibly brilliant and they deliver messages that just fall flat because they don't know how to tell a story. They don't know how to, create connection through the way they use their voice and the way that they show warmth or passion for something.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always ways to show competence, and yet it never has to be either or. You always want to find ways to show your warmth and humanity. There's room for both, and some of that is the inner game. If I go back to the athletics, it's like, yes, there were times I needed to go really deep in my whole routine, because I think everyone, leaders, people in sports, high stakes moments require, what are you doing pre-game? That's
Mm-hmm.
key. How do you get yourself in the right mindset? How do you visualize? How do you stay in your body? Because again, if you're just in your head, you're only accessing a fraction of what you're capable of. So dropping back into your body and being really grounded, because people read confidence through body language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then going into that situation, then like you said, if you have something different with a different group of people, you're going to adjust those ratios and figure out where they're going to be connected, where they're going to be communicated, that warmth and that competence and whatever else, is in those qualities that you want. So it isn't a one and done, like lock and load and you never think about it again. Presence means you are present to what is going on, what is happening in the moment, who are you meeting with, how are they responding to you? You may have to adjust. Right? If you're reading people, if you're reading a room, your presence, it doesn't become inauthentic. You don't become a chameleon, but you say, oh, I need to step into this more. I need to bring more of this energy forward. So it's getting past, again, that one dimension with which we know ourselves, to actually see that we have a greater range that we can access, a greater capacity.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I have a question, just thinking about leadership presence. I'm not even necessarily sure that I know the right way to ask the question. Kind of throw it out. How does either societal norms or the pressures of how is leadership presence different? How are leaders challenged differently from male to female, either gender based, or even how does ethnicity play into it? How are some challenged more than others? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. It's a great question and a really important lens to look through it with. And I want to make a distinction. So leadership presence, I define as, that alignment of your substance and style and character. And then nested within that is executive presence. And that's the perception of your potential. So that's the evaluations that people make of your leadership potential. And that's where, people get feedback of like, oh, you don't quite have the executive presence we're looking for. You need to increase your executive presence. It can be really vague, right? And in that kind of feedback, women and men are judged differently. So if the three main pillars are gravitas, the three main pillars of executive presence are readings, perceptions of gravitas, of how you communicate, and then also your appearance. Things that are deemed as just having grit and being direct and leaderly, in terms of gravitas for men, women get penalized for as being too pushy or too bossy or too bold or not being a team player. It can be the exact same words said out of the mouth of two different people, and it's read differently. And so research shows that women and people of color have a lot trickier time because there are all these narrow double binds and what's acceptable. So their experience with executive presence is that it's been more about conformity. It's felt more oppressive because it has been to these standards that are based in like a white patriarchal corporate or expectations. And so it hasn't been about honoring an authentic expression or even being explicit about why are these expectations around executive presence, why are they required? Where do they come from? It's everything around hair. I know Black women have a lot of history around, norms and bias around hair styles. And, it actually goes quite deep. I think a lot of talk around executive presence is actually nested within DEI conversations.
So a lot, to me, that that makes total sense. Everything you said, that's almost what I expected. Do you see that changing? Has it changed? Do you see it continuing to change, or is it really still mired in the way it's always been?
I don't think it's changing fast enough.
kind of what I thought.
I think, I work a lot with entrepreneurs, and I will say that there are just so many horror stories of people leaving organizations and having had, significant careers, chapters of their lives where they finally are like, I can't take it anymore. And it's because the systems are just set up in such a way that they haven't evolved, and it's important. I think it is changing. I think we're all working to change those systems. So the conversation really is about how do we look at the world we're operating in right now? Because again, in order for people to be successful, to step into leadership roles, they have to know what the expectations are.
Right.
You have to receive that explicit feedback around executive presence, or else they get this like, oh, positive reviews. And then they get fired, and it's like they didn't have enough executive presence or they didn't get the job. And they're like, but I don't even know what that is. So we have to make more explicit the world we're operating in now as we build the world we want to live in.
Here's what I love about I love, first of all, thank you for coming. Thanks for bringing all of that. That's great stuff. Because as much as all of this is relevant to a CEO who, to our listener who wants to improve her or his executive presence, I think there's also an awareness for a listener what's going on in my organization?
Mhm.
You know, are we being open to? Are we aware of the fact that we hold women and people of color to a different standard, right? What we would value in potentially a male executive somehow becomes a knock against a woman or a person of color,
Mhm.
potentially for that same position. So my hope is that, you know, there's as a takeaway for the leader, him or herself, but also how do we improve the whole organization and make sure that we're just awareness and accelerating that change. So.
Mhm. Yeah. You know, people feel the least present when they don't feel seen. So, in this aspect of creating a culture in which people feel seen, heard, and valued, you know, it's so critical that leaders are thinking about their own presence, but are they creating an environment in which everyone can show up present? You know, because that's when you elevate everything, right?
Yeah.
When you're present as a leader, when your presence speaks volumes, and also you're bringing out the presence of everyone else. It's a really powerful way, and we know that people leave companies when they don't feel seen, heard, or valued, more
Right.
than about
They
money
do.
or about anything else. So I don't see the conversation around presence is not like, oh, this is just a nice to have or some afterthought. It actually is critical. It's key.
Mhm. Are
And
there
again, go ahead, Leb.
Are there any like startling discoveries, like stories, you know, you can mention where someone you unlock something and someone's like, "Oh, wow, that really is a part of my authentic self," or
Yeah, okay. I have one person who's been coming to mind during our conversation who she was the founder of a company, and so she started this company and took it to be a 500 person tech company, very successful. She was winning awards, really getting into the spotlight. And when she came to me, she expressed some of those. She's a very confident person, and also we did some of that initial discovery right around her operating system. We used the Enneagram, so it was like understanding what is your way of communicating, what's your way of showing up in the world that just feels authentic to you, but it's really a mask that you wear, right? Once we could understand that, we could get some read of her energy, because we connect with people across all these different channels, right? So there's our appearance, there's our body language, there's all the communication, that's the how we communicate, there's our digital footprint, and there's our energy. So what we learned was she had this very direct, bold energy, and her visual presence, which she felt really confused by. She felt like maybe she wasn't dressing her age. She didn't know how to put herself together in a way that felt leaderly, right? And maybe it was too youthful or too playful. She didn't know. And second, she discovered, or she revealed, right, in our conversations, because a lot of our work is through conversation, that what was making sense to her now is her team constantly told her how confusing they found her, and that people were afraid of her because she gave off one impression of this like young, lively, cutesy, kind of friendly clothes appearance, right? And if our appearance is that first filter we see, and then she followed up with a very direct, challenging, confrontational personality.
Mhm.
And people be like, whoa, that wasn't what I was expecting. And so they couldn't make sense of her. And she realized that she was having such a hard time communicating with her team because there was all this cognitive dissonance. There wasn't alignment.
Mhm.
So that was an example of where once we cleared up the visual static, she actually could continue being, her greatest assets were that she, as a leader, was very forthright. She invited people to, like, she loved sparring over ideas and having debates, all that. She welcomed it. But we had to get rid of all this visual static so people felt like there was only one person in front of them instead of trying. They spent a lot of mental energy trying to make sense of her. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's fascinating, but and then it kind of leads to the next question. Maybe there's not an appropriate answer for it, but then it's like, well, how, what choices do I make to change my appearance in such a way that people can feel that the inconsistency is not conflicting and we can connect better. And,
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like one thing leads to another. It's like insight and then the action.
Mm-hmm. There has to be that, right? There's always the awareness. We start with awareness, and then it's what action can I take, right? How do I, once we learn there's that dissonance, and then we identify, okay, well, what does that best version of you look and feel like? And it should never be someone else waving a magic wand and changing you who you are. It's a discovery process. And
Right.
they're a guide with you. They're helping you and revealing, they're helping you reconnect with parts of yourself that you maybe have kept under wraps, or to help them visually get translated. It can be as simple as, I'll use another example of a client who, she felt like she was not getting any respect. People couldn't see her gravitas, and was a woman running for public office. She was short, and so she literally felt like people just looked over her. She had a youthful appearance, and she's incredibly serious, has all the gravitas, but people couldn't pick up on it. And she was literally just wearing clothes that just looked like she maybe had just run an errand to the library. And I said, listen, you need to have an appearance that conveys the gravitas so that people visually see it and they recognize that's a leader, right? And so we did that by actually working on the structure and cut of her clothes, and went from kind of all these like drapey, I call them friendly clothes, to more structured suits and blazers that defined her silhouette. And that made a huge difference, where now she looked like a leader. Again, you have to look like a leader and then act like a leader, and it has to go all the way through. But she stopped having to fight so hard, because once people don't see you, you have to work extra hard to get your message heard, because they've already discounted you.
I think you used the word earlier, congruent.
Yes.
And it's striking me again, that congruency. I mean, we in our work use the word alignment. So it's like, how are things lined up so that there's some flow and some connection?
Yes, because when you have that, there's greater resonance, and that's where your impact happens. That's where the results happen, is when you're in alignment, when there's congruence, when think of it like a hologram. Like, everything about your presence should be holographic to the leader you are. There's just resonance, which just means it's easy. It's all operating in flow, instead of you having to muscle your way through to the top. It's like you get to just be. And that's really leadership. That leadership presence is about, who are you being?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are in your work so I consider myself to be on the warmth side as part of my authentic self. And I've had clients that don't want a handshake, they want a hug. And then now there's like, the Me Too thing. And there, are there adjustments that we all need to make because of what's happening, in this country or in other countries? And it also makes me think, when I'm in Spain, I mean, everybody's smiling and people are hugging, and there's a lot of back slapping, and, or Italy. And I like that, but I also have to be aware of the fact that I have to be sensitive to how other people might receive that warmth.
Yes, it's going back to the idea of authentic leadership doesn't mean, well, this is how I am, this is what I'm going to do, so I'm just going to, shoehorn it my way that into everything I do. It's having that range of reading a room and knowing context. And it is very relevant to understand what are the power dynamics right now, through Me Too, that what's going, can you give yourself, again, more of a range to, like, how do you connect and show warmth so that it isn't, all hugs, if that's the impact that's going to have in a certain situation is not going to be what you want it to be, right? So it's understanding your preference. This is the kind of person I am. This is what where I lean into, and looking up and having the wherewithal and the EQ as well, just to understand who your audience is.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So as we start to close, Patrick, you have any last questions for Katherine before we move into the
No,
let's get practical?
I'm excited to hear our list of let's get practical.
Okay.
I am. There's a lot. So that's good.
So Katherine, we've mentioned that we end our podcast with some let's get practical tips and guidance for our audience. I'm wondering what let's get practical tips you would have for our audience today.
I'm going to start with those 5 components of how we're communicating. So in getting practical, if you can build your self-awareness, right? Do a check-in across all 5 of these elements. The one being appearance, right? And a simple question is just like, how do I think about it? Like, what's your thought process? Where does it factor in? If it's not factoring in at all and you're a leader, then that tells you right there, okay, then you need to spend some time thinking about it, making sure it's aligned. And that means everything from, is it as polished as you want it to be? Is it communicating? Is your presence, visual presence communicating what you want it to communicate? What do you think if people just saw a picture of you? I have people do this. Look at this other person. What do you assume their job is? People are shocked to know that other people, what they think their job might be, just based on appearance. So, it can be uncomfortable or not. I always encourage people to do it with a growth mindset, right? If you were, one of the biggest changes for me as an athlete is when I went from, just wearing whatever ratty t-shirts and shorts to my coach being like, you should show up for every game like you're the champion. And I just did from then on. Like, it wasn't for anybody else but for me. And boy, did it feel different when I put intention and took myself seriously as an athlete. Mm-hmm. That suiting up played a huge role. And it, I challenge anyone to show me a professional athlete that doesn't take their attire and their presence as a huge part of how they show up. So then the second's body language. And that also, none of these are quick fixes. Like, body language, you have to tune into or get a trusted colleague, a coach, a mentor, a boss. I say like, I'm working on my body language. I'd love for you, after this week, can you spend this week and pick out 3 things that you notice about my body language? If you can be as directive as possible. How's my posture? Your posture, how's my eye contact? Pick out some very specific things that people can watch. If it's too vague, people won't really know. You almost have to train people with what they're looking for. Okay. And then with communication, the how you communicate, that's your tone. That's, how passionate you are. How, armor can just be being really mechanical about things versus how do you express yourself? Your digital footprint, that's really relevant in this day and age. Before people meet you, now they're seeing you online in some way, whether it's LinkedIn, whether they're looking up an article you've written. You have a personal brand that precedes you meeting anyone in person. So your digital footprint. So review that, Google yourself. Check out your LinkedIn picture. If it's old, if it doesn't look like you anymore, if it's more than a few years old, that creates another form of cognitive dissonance. I know like nobody talks about this, but it is true. When you see someone's picture and they meet in person and they do not look alike, you spend a few minutes in your brain being like, do they not know that they don't look like their picture anymore? Like, what's happening? And they are only half giving you their attention because it was so confusing.
It's very true.
It's true. No one wants to admit it, but that is like happening all the time. They're trying to sort out where's the disconnect. And then your energy, that's part of your authentic leadership. Is there energy? And is it, warm? Are you inspiring? Are you letting your enthusiasm come through? If you're overly choreographed and think you have to really control it, like your confidence is contagious, your passion is contagious. So know the energy you bring. And if it's energy that's really, if it's so intellectual and critical, that's really a downer for a lot of people. We have to really watch how we overthink and, put it into a box of like, well, I'm just really like, I just think a lot of it. I'm just the smart one. It's like, well, you're cutting connection because your energy is an access point for warmth. So we gotta balance that out. Yes, we want the smarts, but we also want you to be human.
Great.
Oh, that's so good.
So this has been fantastic. It's definitely a lot to consider and chew on. I know, thanks to your guidance, I've had myself in the hot seat a few times, and as much as I hated to really lean into something, it has made a significant difference, even to the point of changing my LinkedIn photos. So
yay!
I know that there is a lot of freedom in starting to be more congruent and authentically ourselves. So, Katherine, if people wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always there. And then come to my website. You can learn more about my philosophy. That's www.trueselfpresence.com. And there's also a contact me link there if you wanted to reach out. So there or LinkedIn would be the easiest spots.
Great. And when we post the Let's Get Practical on our website, we'll definitely include Katherine's contact information on that as well. So thank you, listeners. I hope that this session of The Frustrated CEO has lessened your frustrations, or at least pointed you in a direction where you can lessen a few of your frustrations. Please visit us for a recording of this, as well as the Let's Get Practical download at www.thefrustratedceo.com for this episode and for others that have come before it. So we wish you well. We wish you congruence. And thank you again, Katherine, for joining us in a very engaging episode.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to speak with all of you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
So with that, we are signing off.